We have got a bumper day of speakers with us, and to open the 2011 Mind and Potential Conference, we are opening with one of the world's most learned and sought-after speakers on the topic. I won't have to really explain her to any of you guys here. Baroness Susan Greenfield is a scientist, writer, broadcaster, and member of the House of Lords. She's the director of the Institute for the Future of the Mind and professor of pharmacology at Oxford University. And she heads a multidisciplinary research group exploring novel brain mechanisms linked to neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson. She's been awarded over 30 honorary degrees from British and foreign universities, and that's just been in the time that it's taken me to read the intro. Her extraordinary and impressive sacks full of honours and awards are far too numerous to list, but the one I liked the most was that in 2006, Susan Greenfield was made an honorary Australian. Isn't that great? So Baroness Greenfield's book, Idea, the Quest for Identity in the 21st Century, is a must-read. Please welcome the expert's expert on the inner workings of the brain with her presentation Outside the Box, the Neuroscience of Creativity, Baroness Susan Greenfield.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Catherine, for that very kind introduction. There is one accolade that I'd also like to flag, because my mum was so proud of it, involving the 50 most inspirational women in the world. And the reason I want to flag it and why mum was so pleased is that I came in at number 14, whilst Camilla Parker Bowles was number 39. And however, the thing was put in perspective when we looked down the list, and number 9 was Dolly Parton. So I think we have to get these things in perspective. And it's wonderful to be back in my honorary country again. What we're going to do this morning, and I'm very honored and flattered to be the first person up to speak to you, is to give the neuroscience perspective on something that normally we don't associate with science, and certainly not with neuroscience, and that's creativity. Are we going to be able, in this brief half hour, to find a way that neuroscience can actually contribute, and I do stress contribute, to this very exciting issue that really is going to be, I think, at a premium in the 21st century. How can we go from the sludgy brain that you could get under your fingernails, how can you go from that to an idea, a creative idea? And it takes me back a long time ago, and I dissected the brain at Oxford, and I held the brain rather as this picture shows, and I wondered, you know, if somebody loved, or you had a habit or a memory, imagine getting that under your fingernail. Rather odd idea. So what we're going to do is to ask 4 basic questions. And the first is our creativity genetically determined? So this is DNA. Can anyone see creativity trapped in there, or even being witty, or good housekeeping, or being kind? It's particularly unspectacular looking, isn't it? It looks a bit like cotton wool. So what I want to do first is to put genes literally in their place. Of course they're important. Of course they are. We know that when genes go wrong, then you have severe malfunction. But that's not to say that's the whole story. And what I want to show you now is that, of course, genes are necessary for function of the brain and body, but that doesn't mean to say they are sufficient. And this is a classic experiment where even in mice we can see that the environment is all important. The experiment involved a disease that I'm sure many of you have heard of called Huntington's disease. It used to be called Huntington's chorea because, as you can see from this picture, the patient presents with wild, involuntary flinging of the limbs in a grotesque caricature of dance, and chorea in Greek is to dance. Now, Huntington's disease is one of the few brain disorders that actually relates to a single rogue gene. Unlike most other malfunctions, and certainly most other functions, if you have the gene for Huntington's disease, you will, in middle age, sadly develop this severe movement disorder. So why am I telling you about this? Well, in this, to my mind, classic experiment, the experimenters took mice and they deliberately tweaked their genes so they had the mouse equivalent of Huntington's chorea. Now, this meant that you could actually quantify the onset of the disease as the mice aged, because a movement test is quite an easy thing to measure, and you can assign scores. In this case, the higher the score, the worse the movement. But the whole point of the experiment was to nonetheless see that even though you had the direct link between the bad gene and the movement impairment developing as one aged, even so, could the environment make a difference? So half the rats that had the genetic modification, so-called transgenic mice, were kept in simple, standard lab conditions, as shown here. However, their luckier counterparts were kept in what's called an enriched environment. Now, enriched for a mouse doesn't mean to say that they come to the Minds in its Potential conference and have lots of interesting, hopefully inspirational talks. They're much more modest in their expectations. And enrichment for a mouse is, as you can see, little ladders and wheels and tubes and so on. And that was the only difference between the otherwise genetically identical mice. Let's see if this had an effect. Well, you can see here the age of the mice in days, and in the vertical scale, you can see the score, and the higher the score, the worse the movement. And as always, you have the control group, in this case, the non-Huntingtons shown in red, where, as you might imagine, they were perfectly normal mice, their movements were just fine, they were therefore scoring 0 throughout. However, the animals that had been genetically modified to have this movement disorder were living out their genetic destiny, and as you can see, as they are aging, so their score is getting higher because their movements are getting worse. But what we're interested in, aren't we, is the group that had the impact of the environmental enrichment, and look at them. So you can see the age of onset is later, and the degree of impairment is much more modest, and the only difference is the environment. So if this happens with a single gene disorder, which is very rare, to mice who are far more modest in their repertoire than we are, exposed merely to a few little ladders and wheels, how much more for you does the environment have an impact? So let's think about that. I don't know if there's any goldfish lovers here in the audience, but let's be brutal. Goldfish don't have great personalities, do they? You don't expect a goldfish to be particularly creative. And if you were particularly heartless, if your kids had a goldfish and the goldfish died, you could go off to the pet shop and buy another goldfish while the child was at school. And when they came back, they wouldn't know any difference. Obviously, some people have done that. I can hear from the laughing, clearly. Now, you couldn't do that with pet cats or dogs, and much as they might want you to, you certainly couldn't do it with their brothers or sisters. Why is this? Why is the human brain, the mind, so different? Why is it that we occupy more ecological niches than any other species on the planet? We don't run particularly fast, we don't see particularly well, we're not particularly strong compared to other species. What is it we do so well? Well, the clue lies in what makes us individual, what makes us special, and that is we have the superlative ability to adapt to our environment. And guess what? If you adapt to your environment, if you have individual experiences, therefore, you become an individual. So here we see the basis for that, and I like to think of this as the basis of the mind. I'm fed up with philosophers thinking there's some airy-fairy alternative to the squalor of the biological brain. So here you see, for those of you who aren't familiar with these kind of pictures, the blobby bits are the brain cells, the neurons, and the stringy bits are the connections. And you can see in the first 2 years of life, the growth of the brain is caused not by the proliferation of more blobby bits, brain cells, but by the configurations, the growth of the connections between them. Now, this means that even if you are a clone, an identical twin, you are going to have a unique configuration of brain cell connections. Why? Because these connections are shaped by your individual experience. This is something we call plasticity. It doesn't mean to say the brain, of course, is made of plastic, but rather from the Greek plastikos, to be molded. Let me show you one example of plasticity, and this is a lovely experiment involving 3 groups of adult human volunteers, none of whom could play the piano. Word of advice, if ever you get to volunteer for such an experiment, try and not be in the control group, because they stared at a piano for 5 days, did nothing else. However, the more interesting, luckier group actually learned 5-finger piano exercises. And what we're going to see now is the astonishing change in the plasticity of the brain, in the change in the brain scans, even after 5 days of simply learning 5-finger piano exercises. But there's also a third group, and I'm going to keep them as a surprise. So here we go. Days 1 to 5, left to right. The controls, as you see, the brain is literally unimpressed. Nothing's happened, yeah? Nothing's happened. But look at those who played the 5-finger piano exercises. As you can see, there's an astonishing change in the brain territory relating to the digits. But my surprise group for you, the exciting group, are those on the third panels, because they merely imagined they were playing the piano. Yeah, isn't that exciting? So just think, unless you've fallen asleep, you're thinking now, yeah? And that's changing in your brain. Yeah? Isn't that exciting? And the man, for my mind, who said the absolutely right quote that describes this, he developed L-DOPA therapy, which is the therapy used for Parkinson's disease even now, although he developed it several decades ago. He said, thinking is movement confined to the brain. thinking is movement confined to the brain. And you can see here that's exactly what's happening. The crucial issue is not the contraction of the muscle, it is the thought that has preceded it, that has left its mark on the brain. So you can see now how we cannot separate out mental and physical and mind from brain. So because I'm a neuroscientist, not a psychologist, we want to know what is happening down there in the brain. What's happening with the brain cells at the literal level? Not thinking of metaphors or anything like this, but what's really happening to brain processes. Well, in order to do that, we go back to the rodents and again to the enriched environment. And this picture is indeed from my own lab of the graduate students loved making this environment for the rats. And you can see how happy the rats look, you know, especially the one on the bottom right. Having a lovely time there with all the branches and tubes and things. You see, they're really exploring. Now, if you compare a single brain cell from an animal that wasn't quite so lucky, who was in the control group, again, this might look unfamiliar, but I'd like you to focus on these branches that are coming out of the blobby bit and compare that with this, which is a brain cell from an animal who had had the enriched, stimulating environment. You can see there's a difference. So what's going on? Well, rather like with exercise, when you're engaged in a stimulating, enriched environment, your brain cells will work harder. They'll be more active. And in response to that, rather like when muscles work hard, they grow, what happens here when brain cells work hard, they grow more branches. Now, why is that interesting or important? Well, if you grow more branches, you are increasing the surface area of the brain cell. That is to say, you're making more space for one brain cell to make connections with another. In fact, up to 100,000 connections can converge now on these branches. So this means you can make more connections. If you make connections, you can see one thing in terms of something else. So let's now think of that in the human brain. Here you see top left, again, a brain cell, this time injected with a fluorescent dye, so you can see what they really look like, these very beautiful branches, which are called dendrites, after the Greek for tree, because they just look like a tree. And here you can see a schematic tree in the middle, showing various points of contact, and that's even more abstracted on the right, where you can get the idea that if you make connections of one thing in terms of something else, then perhaps I would like to suggest it has a significance to you. It will mean something to you that it will not mean to someone else. So for example, think of a wedding ring. When a small child is shown something gold and shiny that they can roll and stick things through the center of, that's all it is. But as you grow, that wedding ring will have a cultural significance according to the culture you're born in, and then you eventually might have a wedding ring of your own, which has even more significance because of the associations or connections it forms. And when you're aware of associations between one thing and something else, I'd like to suggest to you that's what we mean by understanding. An example of why we need to see one thing in terms of something else to understand comes from, I'd like to give you an example of my own childhood when I was 16, and I have a brother who's much younger, and he was only 3. And part of the bullying that used to be rampant with this little brother of mine, and the torture that I used to put him through, one of the many devices was to force him to learn Shakespeare. And so he learned off like a little parrot. He learned off lines of Macbeth. And there's a very famous one, I'm sure you know, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. And as someone said, that must have gone down a storm in playgroup to have someone coming in. Creeps in this petty pace from day to day. Last limits of recorded time, all our yesterdays. Anyway, it then goes on, as I'm sure you know. Out, brief candle, life is but a poor player. And had you said to him, Graham, what does it mean, out, brief candle? Do you understand out, brief candle? He would have said, yeah, I blow a candle, it goes out. He wouldn't have said, oh, it's a metaphor for death. How could he? He was only 3. But to see one thing in terms of something else means you can really understand it. So let's think of that in ourselves. You're born, in the words of the great psychologist William James, into a booming, buzzing confusion. You'll evaluate the world in senses. How sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright. But can you imagine now having an abstract visual pattern and accompanied by sounds, abstract sounds? But if that visual pattern and the colors and shapes and sounds present again and again and again, so it will forge connections, and those connections will enable you to understand what you are seeing, i.e., to have a cognitive experience, in Latin cogito, I think. So now, instead of being an abstract colors and shapes and sounds, it'll be your mum. And if mum features again and again and again in your life, let's hope she does, then she will have a significance to you that she does not have to anyone else. So here's an example. This is not my mother, but these are male colleagues of mine, and I assume you will see them as white middle-aged men in suits and ties. You might go so far as to think they're probably scientists, you'd be right. But for me, they're Chris and Martin and David and so on, and I have shared with them the highs and lows that comes with doing basic research. So they are highly significant to me. They mean a lot to me, and they won't mean anything to you. Similarly, you could show me your friends, family, and colleagues, and I would see them as generic men, women, and children, but they will mean a lot to you in the way they don't mean a lot to me. So in this way, by virtue of our neuronal connections, we can start to navigate the world, which is why we're so successful as a species, because we can start to understand what's going on. We can see one thing in terms of something else. And every time you have an experience, you can evaluate it now in terms of what's happened already, and at the same time, that ongoing experience will update your neuronal connections. So I'd like to suggest that the biological basis of the mind is the personalization of the physical brain through the unique dynamic configuration of brain cell connections, in turn driven by unique experiences. So here we are. This is downtown Oxford. Everyone has their unique trajectory in space and time with a past, a present, and a future. And those experiences and that interaction you are incessantly having, more and more individual experiences making you more and more of an individual, they are embedding themselves in your neuronal connections. And that is what we mean by neuronal plasticity. That is why a human mind is so special. And that is why we can't just look at genes. Next question. What happens in the brain then during the creative process? Okay, so here's an art or a creative process. What can we say about this? Well, clearly you don't see many people looking like this. So the artist has deconstructed, he's challenged or she's challenged the dogma of what people would normally look like and then brought together unusual elements. So perhaps the first stage then in creativity is to deconstruct, as that artist just did, to abstract sensations. Most of us adults are not very successful at painting because we paint a tree as a tree rather than seeing the light and the textures and the colors and so on. In science also, when you are being creative, you do have to challenge dogma. Why are we assuming such and such and such and such? The man that invented the Mini, for example, Mini car, he challenged dogma. Why should the engine be in front of the car? So the first step is just to deconstruct. The second, as we've just seen, is unusual associations. So, for example, here we have an unusual sheep. This is painted by Phoebe Collins, aged 4, the daughter of one of my postdocs at the time. Now, you can see that she's complied with both those criteria. You don't normally see sheep looking like this. She's challenged the dogma of black and white sheep, and she's introduced unusual elements. So why is this sheep not hanging in an art gallery, whereas her sheep is? What's the difference between these two sheep that would qualify the second, her sheep, for being a work of art? Whether you like it or not, it does hang in galleries. Well, I'd like to suggest that both have deconstructed, both have brought together unusual associations, but there's a huge difference, so let me just go back, in that these new associations have had a meaning that is raised and driven by her sheep, but not by Phoebe's. So in order, I would like to suggest for unusual pairings, unusual words together, unusual shapes and colors presented together, unusual scientific theory, it only has validity if it has a significance, a meaning, if it will in turn, therefore, drive other connections in your brain. Next question. How can we maximize the opportunities for creativity? Surely that's what we really want to know. Well, sadly, having shown you how the environment has an impact on the human brain, you can now see, I'd like to suggest, that the environment is changing in an unprecedented way. This is just one statistic. Between a child's 10th and 11th birthday, 900 hours spent in class, just under 1,300 hours with their family. And look at that, just under 2,000 hours in front of a screen. So surely we are looking at a scenario now when we should be thinking, how can we actually maximize and optimize the environment, given it's changing so much and technology is changing it so much? Another study has shown in the States between 13 and 17, over 50% of kids in that age group are spending 30+ hours in front of a screen outside of school. And what concerns me is not the 30, but the plus, because that's at least 4 to 5 hours a day. Just to show that there are some good things, and I'm not the middle-aged Luddite that I'm often portrayed as. Here you can see a book that I would recommend, a wonderfully written book that speaks for itself, Everything Bad is Good for You, by Stephen Johnson, who says there's many skills that one can learn, and among them might be an increase in your IQ scores, because he suggests, and this is very persuasive, that when you play computer games, you're rehearsing the same kinds of skills as when you're passing an IQ test. That is to say, you're looking for mental processes, you have to be very mentally agile, you're looking for a specific answer within a particular time frame. Small wonder then, as you are rehearsing, like with the piano players, as you are rehearsing such a skill, so your IQ ability will therefore seem better. But he says, just because we have indeed seen an increase in IQ scores in the Western world, what we haven't seen, and this is quite insightful, is an increase in insight into the economic situation or into the Middle East crisis. So just because you can process information does not mean to say you have knowledge. There's a big difference between information and knowledge, a big difference between mental processing and understanding. Now, when people play games, you can see here, people often promote multitasking as a good thing, but there is less listening with more multitasking. And what I'd like to focus on are some of the issues that this new screen technology, offering as it does just 2 dimensions and only 2 senses, hearing and vision, why does that outcompete? Why does that outcompete 3 dimensions and 5 senses? So let's have a think about that. One clue might come from this. Now, you may not recognize methylphenidate, and as you can see, there's been an increase in prescriptions for it. If I tell you that methylphenidate is Ritalin, a drug used for attentional deficit disorders, then we can start to get a clue. Could there be a link? It might be that the drug is being more liberally prescribed nowadays. It might be that attentional deficit disorder is being more acknowledged as a condition. Or could it just be, and this is not mutually exclusive, could it just be that if you're putting a brain, a young brain, with the evolutionary mandate that we have just seen to adapt to the environment, if that environment is as I'm about to show you, then who knows, perhaps that might change the connection. So just pretend you're a small child, and this is what you see. Shorter attention span, and here we go. Do you think you might fidget a bit? You know, if you went to school, if you were doing that for so many hours a day, you might just be, someone might just think, just an idea. I think epidemiologists should get on. So we have short attention span, it's strongly sensory, as we've seen, and we know that children are easily distracted. Again, my poor brother, if his ice cream fell on the floor, I'd say, look at the birdie, and fine, the tears would stop. If you say that to a depressed adult, you won't get much thanks for that. So, it's the sensory world, lacking metaphor or abstract concepts. So, for example, if you ask what is honor, which is a very nuanced, subtle, abstract concept, to try and show that on a screen, here's the Queen, of course, because this is British Google, and I Google on this. Now, if you showed that to a Martian, would they understand what honor was, do you think? So, I think if we're showing things on this 2-dimensional literal screen, we do have a problem with metaphor and abstract concepts, just as we do with differentiating information from knowledge. The mental agility to reach a solution, but that's not necessarily understanding. That's having a very rapid and effective and appropriate response to a stimulus. It's not understanding what's happening. So, for example, if you play a computer game to rescue the noble Princess Yukihime, as shown here, let me ask you, do you care about Princess Yukihime? Bet you don't care about her. Whereas if you read a book about a princess, the only reason you'll read the book, the only reason you're turning the pages, is because you care about the characters. And I would suggest that's because the characters they have a meaning. A meaning means you can see one thing in terms of something else. They have a significance. They have a past, a present, and a future, just like you do. Therefore, they have links in time, and they have links with each other, which gives a significance to what is happening in a way that the iconic Princess Yukihime, sadly, has no significance. And just to show that I'm not alone here, and this is from the now chairman of Google, the once CEO, I worry that the level of interrupt, the sort of overwhelming repetitive information, is in fact affecting cognition. It is affecting deeper thinking. I still believe that sitting down and reading a book is the best way to really learn something. I worry that we're losing that. So I think I'm in good company here. So how can we go then from information to insight? Because if we're exploring creativity, then surely that's very important. If we're dealing with a brain now exposed to an environment perhaps where there's reduced understanding. These 2 little boys are playing a computer game, but they're not playing with each other. They're playing with a screen. And yet we know that when you are working with the screen, yes, you might be processing words, but what about these other things? What about eye contact and body language, all of which have huge importance? Voice and pheromones, those sneaky chemicals that you pick up on, and above all, physical contact. And yet none of these things, eye contact, body language, voice tone, pheromones, and physical contact, none of these things are available on Facebook. So how are you going to learn interpersonal skills? How are you going to learn empathy? So in line with that, we know that people who sadly have an impairment in empathy, people with autistic spectrum disorder, they are particularly comfortable in this world, this cyber world. So if we have reduced empathy, another issue, I think, is if you're playing computer games, you're learning a very bad lesson that actions don't have consequences. So might this make you more reckless? Well, let's think about that. Let's think about risk-taking. If you ask a neuroscientist about taking risks, they will cite neurological cases where there is enhanced recklessness resulting from brain damage. And the most famous case of this, the prototype, if you like, was someone called Phineas Gage, who was the foreman on a railway gang, who one day was pushing dynamite or explosive down with something called a tamping iron. It went off prematurely, and the rod, this formidable rod, I'm about to show a squeamish picture, was thrust through the frontal part of his brain, an area called the prefrontal cortex. And he lived to tell the tale, amazingly, and he actually went back to work because he seemed just fine. But only as the weeks unfolded into months did it become apparent that he'd become excessively reckless. Not good if you work with explosive. So he left and ended up as a fairground freak, but sadly the syndrome was repeated in the First World War with shrapnel injuries and the like. And we now know that this area of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is 33% of the human brain, but only 17% of the chimp brain, evolutionary, very sophisticated, that among many other things, if it's damaged, you have enhanced recklessness. Now, very interestingly, other people also are very reckless. For example, obese people. They are more reckless in gambling tasks. And we know that obesity is an issue that we're facing, especially with the cyber world, where kids are not exercising as much as they used to. And interestingly enough, if you have a high body mass index, you'll have a less active prefrontal cortex, as shown here. So there's some kind of link between underactivity of the prefrontal cortex, or damage to the prefrontal cortex, and recklessness. Similarly, people with schizophrenia, as shown here, they have an underactive prefrontal cortex due to a chemical imbalance. They, too, are reckless. And in many ways, schizophrenics are like children. That is to say, they're easily distracted. They have a short attention span. They cannot interpret proverbs. If you say, what does it mean people who live in glass houses mustn't throw stones? Rather like my little brother, who said about the candle, they will give you a literal interpretation. Well, if your house is made of glass, the house will, and I throw a stone, the house will break. And they both have underfunctioning prefrontal cortex. What's really interesting, in children, the prefrontal cortex is only fully active in late teenage years, early 20s. So let's put that together. Anyone who eats knows the consequence of eating, but for some, for obese people, the thrill of the food trumps the consequences. Anyone who gambles knows the consequence of gambling, but the thrill of the roulette wheel will trump the consequences of losing money. And a clue might come from this picture of schizophrenic painting of cats, where top left is a cognitive cat, but by the time you get to bottom right, no one would recognize that as a cat. What's happened here is there's been a transition from cognitive to sensory. Perhaps then the prefrontal cortex enables, when it's fully active, enables us to escape the press of the moment. And when it's underactive, as in all these different conditions, then you are living very much in the moment. And when I suggested this once to a journalist, that people were saying yuck and wow, because I talk fast, she mistyped it as yucca wow. And then that got 75,000 hits on Google in 24 hours. And they got T-shirts of it, and the first church of yucca wow, working people to work. So clearly, this is something that does have appeal nowadays, you know, well, with no consequences, yeah? So just think about it. When you play a computer game, you're aroused and excited, as we've just seen from that short video. For some people, oh, what's happened? Some people, it's addictive. And for many, by definition, it's rewarding. And what these three different mental states have in common is a chemical called dopamine, that you may have heard of, which participates in mediating all those conditions. And we know that dopamine is like a fountain in the brain, which inhibits the prefrontal cortex. So we can start to see a world now of two basic modes of the underfunctioning and active prefrontal cortex. One, strong feelings, one, thinking, sensory versus cognitive. Living in the here and now, as opposed to having a development of past, present, and future. Here, driven by the external environment. Here, by internal perceptions, a continuing notion of identity, if you like. Here, little significance, what you see is what you get. Here, the personalized meaning, the wedding ring will mean something to you. Here, a reduced sense of self. Here, a strong sense of self. And of course, up until now, with wine, women, and song, and drugs, and sex, and rock and roll, we've been able to go and help ourselves have a reduced sense of self by interfering and manipulating the environment, so we let ourselves go. We have a sensational time. No one, after all, wants to have a cognitive time. Here a clear time space of reference. This in infants and children, this older children and adults, this more dopamine, this less. So that's fine, and we've always been like this between these two, as I say, with wine, women and song, drugs and sex and rock and roll. My concern is that with the computer world, we may be skewing things disproportionately. So let's go back to the neuroscience of creativity. We've seen in those cases you have a premium on deconstruct into abstract sensations. We've seen unusual associations, but we must have this meaning, and that is not served by the computer environment. So how can we, therefore, develop a sense of creativity? Well, I'd like to suggest that that is through developing a sense of identity. Perhaps at the moment people don't have a robust sense of identity if they're constantly connected with others and they're living in the moment. You only have to look at the history of blogging. 1999, I just had to tell someone this thing my cat did today. 2004, my God, cat pictures. 2005, moving cat pictures. Pinnacle of civilization, Twitter. 1 p.m, cat just sneezed. 1:02, cat sneezed again. 1:04, cat hasn't sneezed recently, getting worried. Doesn't that remind you of someone? You know, look at me, I'm doing this, look at me, I'm doing that, because if you don't look at me, perhaps I don't exist. So let's think then of how we can confront the future. People who were creative and were highly individual were Shakespeare, Einstein, Mozart. They had nothing in common other than that they had very original brains. So surely individuality and creativity are interdependent. You know that we're not all going to write symphonies, but when you rearrange a kitchen in a new way, or you think, aha, now I understand. Isn't that the most wonderful thing? And whilst I think the current technologies are giving us part of that, we must go to that final stage when we can really help people develop creativity. And this is a shameless plug for my book, which I gather is on sale here, which says this in a less garbled way. But we could be facing now the most exciting time when instead of worrying about the technologies, we harness them so for the first time ever, human beings can truly reach their true creative potential. Thank you very much. Thank you.